Howdy do, everyone. It is That's Admirable here, and today I'm going to be bringing you a video talking a little bit more in depth about mulliganing with this Dragon Warrior build that I've been playing for the last couple of days. My overall record with this deck, I believe, is somewhere in the neighborhood of like 65 and 26 or something like that. It's 60-something and 26. I've been having a fantastic win rate with it. I think it's a very strong performing deck, and in addition to that, I feel like people on ladder aren't quite built for it yet. To give you an idea of some of the matchups I feel like are very favorable, I feel like Zoo Warlock is a pretty good matchup. I feel like Shamans are a pretty good matchup. And I feel like a lot of the other warrior builds that are out there right now are pretty good matchups. Stuff like Rogue and Priest, I don't really count those. I think those are pretty poor decks overall. And I think a lot of the aggressive builds are going to fare pretty well against them. But this in particular does very well against that as well. But one of the big problems I've noticed that people have with this build are kind of mulligans. And so what this video is going to be tailored to is mulliganing strategy in general, and then also mulligan strategy versus certain classes. Now, when I talk about certain classes, obviously I'm not going to be able to know which kind of archetype I'm queuing into, and similarly you won't either. Like if you queue into a mage, you don't quite know if it's tempo mage, if it's freeze mage, if it's some wacky mage. You don't really have a way to tell. And so the way you're going to maximize your win rate against those style of decks is to mulligan for the one you probably, that's going to be most aggressive versus you. It's typically a pretty safe bet. Against the slower decks, you usually have time to find your cards, so getting off to a blistering fast start is not really that big of an issue. Coincidentally as well, when you mulligan against the aggressive decks for your very fast starts, it's kind of what you're mulliganing for against the slower decks anyway. Obviously, if you knew exactly what you were queuing into, you would tailor your mulligans a little bit better. But bear in mind that this is a guide. This is not hard, fast rules. This is what I've been doing. You will tailor this depending on whether or not you make changes to the decks based on what your opponents are playing against. Say you play the same guy twice in a row and you know what matchup you're queuing into, etc. There's a lot of factors to account for, but I think this is here to get you started, get you thinking about what combinations of cards work really well together, and how to approach a certain matchup so that way you can get off to a better start than maybe you usually do with keeping hands. So the first thing I want to talk about is cards that I have yet to ever mulligan. Alexstrasza Champion, Fire War X, Sir Finley Murgleton, and Twilight Guardian. I think these are four of the best cards in your deck. I think every single one of them works towards your overall game plan, and I think every single one of them also gets you off to a pretty blistering fast starts. Now, a couple of other cards that I rarely mulligan in addition to that is Fairy Dragon. I very rarely mulligan this card, and Frothing Berserker. Now, Frothing Berserker, I think, is going to be a little bit more dependent on your matchup, so I'll break that down a little bit later on, but this is an incredibly powerful card. You don't want to be mulliganing it very often, and because you're looking for certain key cards, I'll talk about times that you can absolutely keep it and times that you may want to consider throwing it back. So, again, these four cards, I have yet to mulligan these against any matchup whatsoever. These four cards are your bread and butter cards of the deck. Do not mulligan them away, period. If your hand is this right here, keep it. If your hand is two Alexstrasza Champion, two Fire War X, keep it. If your hand is two Twilight Guardians, an Alexstrasza Champion, and Sir Finley Murgleton, keep it. These cards are so good, you don't want to let them go, period. So I'm not going to touch too much on those, but we'll get into examples later on. So the first matchup we'll talk about here is versus Druid. When you're playing against Druid, the main things to consider are how's my opponent's start of the game going to look. So you're thinking about Wrath, you're thinking about Living Roots, you're thinking about Wild Growth, and you're thinking about some big innervate plays. So the ways to get off against good starts to that, again, in addition to the four cards I already touched on, cards that I often want in this matchup. Frothing Berserker, I think, is super important in this matchup. If your opponent does not have a way to deal with this, like say with Swipe or whatever, I think it's a pretty darn good card to have. Now, Fairy Dragon, I think, is in a really interesting spot, though, where with Fairy Dragon, I do want to keep it because they can't Wrath it and they can't Living Roots it. The problem with it is I don't really want to play it on turn 2 if they're casting turn 1 Living Roots. It's such an easy way for them to answer this card, and then oftentimes it feels like this is just better left in your hand. But I do keep it sometimes. Now, times that I keep Fairy Dragon are when I have, say, Sir Finley Murgleton in my hand. If I have Sir Finley, I can play Sir Finley, it will challenge those 1/1s, and then I can play Fairy Dragon, and it's likely to go uncontested. Now, in a situation like that, say you happen to run into Cthulhu Druid, they have Disciple of Cthulhu, they end up killing your Fairy Dragon. It's not the end of the world, but that's not an ideal situation. Now, because of that, there's also a couple of other cards I think you can keep Fairy Dragon with when you also have some key cards. So if you have Finley, I think you can keep it. I think if you have Fiery War Axe, you can keep it. I think if you have Alexstrasza Champion, you can keep it. And if you've got Twilight Guardian, I don't know why you're pitching that card away, to be perfectly honest with you. Like, if I had this hand plus Fairy Dragon, 100% keep. No question about it. But again, that's not too hard to talk about. When you have the busted cards, it's pretty easy to keep the rest of your hand. So the key is kind of identifying which cards are going to combo well based on what you already have there. So say we trim this down a little bit. Say I knew I was mulliganing everything except this. Now I look at Fairy Dragon, and I wonder how good it is. So this is going to be a difference of kind of whether or not I have coin, or whether or not I don't have coin. So when I'm going first, and let's say these two are in my hand, and I have, say, Malkarok that I want to mulligan away, I'm probably looking at this and going, you know what? I don't think I need this Fairy Dragon. I know I'm going to play turn 2 Fiery War Axe, and if I'm playing turn 2 Fiery War Axe and he has turn 1 Living Roots, I bet Ravaging Ghoul, Frothing Berserker, and Twilight Guardian are going to look a lot better. If you're going first and you have this, go ahead and pitch them both away. That's kind of the way that I end up approaching the Druid matchup for the most part. So let's talk about Warrior afterwards. Warrior is a matchup that's super wide open right now. It's so difficult to identify what Warrior deck you could possibly be playing against that it's pretty much right to just try to take the aggressive stance and go from there. So cards in addition I don't mulligan this matchup. Well, number one is Frothing Berserker. I think Frothing Berserker is sort of the card that defines this matchup. When you get off to a good start with Frothing Berserker, you're able to kind of squash your opponent. And if they check it early on with like Execute, you're usually in pretty good shape. Core Crown Elite. Core Crown Elite is a card that I keep in this matchup if I have the coin. If you're going first and your opponent plays turn 2 or turn 3 Frothing Berserker, Core Crown Elite will not answer that card. If you are going second and your opponent plays turn 3 Core Crown Elite, you can coin... I'm sorry, and they play turn 3 Frothing Berserker. You can coin Core Crown Elite, run over the Frothing Berserker, and have a 4-1 left over. That's going to offset their tempo, it's going to force them to have answers, it puts them in pretty uncomfortable positions. And then, of course, Fairy Dragon. Fairy Dragon I don't think is a card that you mulligan at all in this matchup. If they don't have Fiery War Axe, this card is going to get value. Not only that, but it makes some of your other cards that you happen to draw sometimes a lot better. So we'll talk about this a little bit more in depth. If you have Fiery War Axe in your hand, cards that are often very good with this, Ravaging Ghoul, and that's basically about it in terms of cards that you can keep extra because you have Fiery War Axe. And again, the reason this is so important is because of Frothing Berserker. You have to check that card. If you don't, your opponent's going to run away with the game. So if you have Fiery War Axe, consider keeping Ravaging Ghoul. I have done it a lot, and I've had a lot of success with it in the past. Being aggressive in that matchup is kind of the key to victory, and an early start and offsetting an early start are often going to be ways that you find yourself beating that. Hunter. Now, I have found Hunter to be one of the hardest matchups, period. And when I say one of the hardest matchups, period, I mean in terms of mulligans. I can't quite figure this one out yet. So once again, obviously not mulliganing these cards, but now we take a look at everything else in the deck that's kind of good versus this. Well, Frothing Berserker is kind of a problem. Ravaging Ghoul's pretty good. Slam is okay. Core Crown Elite's fine. The problem with these cards is that they don't really do anything. And so what I mean by they don't really do anything is you don't really get off to a fast start against this deck, and the way you're going to beat it is by taking the board and keeping the board. So a hand like this looks like it's pretty okay versus Hunter. We have Slam for a 3-2. We could play Frothing Berserker afterwards, but then Ravaging Ghoul, it's decent for some of the 2-1s. What are we actually going to do with this Ravaging Ghoul? So kind of keep that in mind for a second here. If these cards aren't very good, let's say the Frothing Berserker and the Core Crown Elite, what makes these two good? Well, I don't think Ravaging Ghoul's that good. Frankly, I don't think Slam's that good. Now, I will say this. When you're going first, I think Slam goes up way more in importance than when you're going second. If you're going second, your opponent, sometimes they'll lead Fiery Bat, they'll play into a 3-2, they'll slam the 3-2, they'll play an Animal Companion, you have nothing to do. Period. When you're going second, you can say go to your opponent, they can coin a 3-2, you can slam it, they can play another 3-2, then you can play Frothing Berserker. So think about that. When you're going first and you have Slam and Frothing Berserker, now we have a real sequence of plays here. Sure, sometimes they'll play turn 1 Fiery Bat, you won't slam it, maybe you will. They'll play something else, you'll play Frothing Berserker. So think about that. What are the consequences of not slamming a Fiery Bat in that situation? Well, it means that your Frothing Berserker is going to get challenged often. So even if your opponent plays Fiery Bat, probably need to slam in that situation. But it's the difference between going first and going second. When you're going first, you get to play Slam and then lead into something. When you're going second, you don't get to do that. You slam as a response. So Slam, not a keep when you're going second. If you have it going first, it's reasonable, and then you can also keep Frothing Berserker along with it. Fairy Dragon is the one card I think is in a weird spot in this matchup, where it doesn't challenge their 1-drop, and it trades evenly for either of their 2-drops. It's probably a card I don't want to keep. And then similarly with Alex Strauss's Champion. Now, Alex Strauss's Champion is really good, period. But the reason it's so good oftentimes versus the aggressive decks is that you get to trade with it. So if you play Alex Strauss' champion, and they play Fiery Bat, 50% of the time you get to keep your Alex Strauss' champion. Probably the one exception to this rule in terms of keeping Alex Strauss' champion is Hunter. I would tend to not keep it. The cards I'm desperately digging for, Fiery Warax, Sir Finley. These are two of the best cards. Twilight Drake, of course, is really good. Now, if you have Sir Finley, or you have Twilight Guardian, if you have Sir Finley or if you have Fiery Warax, we'll go with Sir Finley first. You can consider keeping Blood to Ichor. The reason behind that is if you play turn 1 Sir Finley, they coin out 3-2. You can Blood to Ichor, attack with Sir Finley. Your 2-2 is going to challenge the next 3-2. It's a consideration. I probably would keep in that matchup. When you have Fiery Warax, cards that go up way in value. I think Ravaging Ghoul goes way up in value. We can use Fiery Warax plus the Ravaging Ghoul to clear, say, a Misha from Animal Companion or a Leok from Animal Companion. And if you have Fiery Warax, you can also consider keeping Blood to Ichor. Blood to Ichor serves kind of the same purpose as Ravaging Ghoul does, deals extra 1 damage to clear out something. You get to have something on the board. We'll move on to Mage, where Mage is, again, kind of another tricky matchup where I don't necessarily feel super comfortable against it, but all the 4 initial cards are super important, and cards I've also found really important in this matchup, Slam. I think Slam is super important against this deck. Like, in fact, it's so important that I would recommend also automatic keeping this card if you draw it in your opening hand against this deck. You need to answer the Cult Sorcerer, and you need to answer Sorcerer's Apprentice, and you need to answer them pretty desperately. If you don't answer them, you're going to get run over. Now, Core Chrono Elite is also a card that happens to be in a really good spot in this matchup, in that it's a direct answer to Flamewaker if they don't have Mirror Image to go along with it. However, I will not be keeping Core Chrono Elite unless I have one of the following cards. Alex Strauss' champion, Fiery Warax, Slam, or Fairy Dragon. If I don't have one of these cards, Slam's kind of in the wrong place. If I don't have one of these cards, I am going to Mulligan Core Chrono Elite in search of one of these cards. So keep that in mind. If you have one of these 4 cards, you can also keep Core Chrono Elite to answer Flamewaker. If they don't have Flamewaker, it's not that big a deal. It's still a 4-3 against a deck where it's pretty powerful. Paladin. Many of the Paladin builds I see are N'Zoth Paladin, but Aggro Paladins are starting to creep back up. So I think versus Aggro Paladin, it gets pretty darn standard. We're keeping these 4 cards, obviously. Not really any reason to mulligan any of these. Fairy Dragon can also be kept. I think it's totally fine versus the aggressive decks. You're going to trade 1 for 1, but you get a lot of information about where they're at afterwards. Outside of that, I consider keeping Frawling Berserker, but I'm only going to keep Frawling Berserker if I happen to have one of the other initial 4 cards that are super powerful in this matchup. If I don't have any of those, I'm pitching back Frawling Berserker and search for one of these 4 cards. Those are all super powerful versus Paladin. Paladin, I think, is a pretty easy matchup. Stick to that one. Priest is an interesting story, where all 4 of these cards, obviously, again, very powerful against this deck, but I think Frawling Berserker is hyper powerful against this deck. I would not mulligan this card, period, regardless of what was in my hand. Execute is also a card that's really interesting in this matchup, and I think you should consider keeping, because one of the ways that Priest gets you is they get a big minion on board, they get ahead of you, and they get to heal it over and over again. So I think Execute is worth consideration. I would never keep 2, but I would sometimes keep 1. And then Fairy Dragon. I think Fairy Dragon kind of fits into the camp of cards that you can often keep, simply because a 2-mana 3-2 that they can't kill with Holy Smite or with Shadow Word Pain is a pretty big deal. I would pretty much always keep it in this matchup. Get off to your early start, blow up their stuff, start attacking them in the face. This matchup is fairly easy, just mulligan for the right cards, and you have a lot of them you can mulligan for. Rogue is kind of in the same spot, where, once again, they don't really answer these 4 cards very properly. If you have one of these 4 cards, if you have one of these 3 cards, you can also keep Frawling Berserker, so keep that in mind. And you can also keep Fairy Dragon in this matchup. Fairy Dragon is really only vulnerable to SI7 Agent, and that's a perfect reason to keep this card. Go ahead and keep it in your hand, slam it against them, attack them, beat them up in the face. I don't think that Rogue is a very strong deck against this one. Nothing really to worry about here. Shaman is where things get a little bit interesting, because once again, these 4 cards incredibly powerful, but there's a couple things that come into play. These 4 cards incredibly powerful, but there's a couple things that come into play. Number 1, let's say you have a Fiery Warax or you have an Alex Strauss' champion. Very similar to Hunter in this manner. This is where Ravaging Ghoul and Blood to Ichor go up way in value. Is because when you have one of these 2, you can also combine it with either Ravaging Ghoul or Blood to Ichor to help swing the board back in your favor. If you are going second, this is where things can get cool. You can keep Fairy Dragon. If you're going first, Fairy Dragon's going to come down on turn 2. They're going to buff up their Tunnel Trog or their Argent Squire. They're going to trade into your Fairy Dragon. You're going to feel like an idiot. Now, There is sometimes when I'm just okay with the strength of my hand, and that time is when it's this. I think that mulliganing for Fiery War Axe and Alexstrasza Champion when you're going first and have this hand it still could be worth it. I haven't really done enough, but I have found success being able to play turn 2 Fairy Dragon. They oftentimes play Argent Squire. Or let's say, like, you're going turn 1, you say go. They play Argent Squire. You play Fairy Dragon. They use Abusive Sergeant, kill your Fairy Dragon. They now have a 2-1 and a 1-1 on board. Ravaging Ghoul cleans these up, gives you a 3-3 on board. Situation where it's totally fine. Now, the way it doesn't work is with this and Blood to Ichor. This is not a keep. Do not keep Blood to Ichor against Shaman unless you have pretty much exactly Fiery War Axe. With Fiery War Axe, Blood to Ichor is very good. Without Fiery War Axe, Blood to Ichor is very bad. In this matchup, you need to get off to an early start, you need to swing the board, and you need to keep going. So say your hand looks something like this. I think this is also pretty keepable. You can play turn 2 Fiery War Axe, take out their threat, or you can play turn 2 Fire Axe, wait, they play, say, Tunnel Trog, Totem Golem on turns 1 and 2. You can play Frothing Berserker on turn 3, Fiery War Axe into the Tunnel Trog. You now have a 3-4 challenging the Totem Golem. If he chooses to trade in, you now have a 4-1 that's going to trade well on board. And if you don't have a 4-1 that's going to be trade on board, because say they use Rockbiter Weapon or Flame Tongue Totem, it means that Ravaging Ghoul can sometimes come into effect here and have a big effect. Basically kind of the same way as Hunter, though. You need to get off to a good start and really punish him for that. We'll move into Warlock now, where, again, this is the one where it's really tricky, because if they're playing Reno Lock, I think it's a bad matchup, and you probably just need to try to aggro them down. And so, once again, taking a look at it, you're going to keep these 4 cards. When you have Alexstrasza Champion, you probably need a dragon with this as well. This is probably the one matchup where I'm not necessarily willing to mulligan all my dragons. I don't think Fairy Dragon's very good in the matchup, but if I have Alexstrasza's Champion, I will keep Fairy Dragon, simply because when they play, say, turn 1 Voidwalker, and you can either coin Alexstrasza's Champion into it, or on your turn 2 play Alexstrasza's Champion into it, run it over, you can follow up with Fairy Dragon, and the Fairy Dragon's just really not that bad in that situation. When you have Fiery War Axe, you can also keep Ravaging Ghoul. You can also, once again, keep Fairy Dragon, and now you can also keep Frothing Berserker. So in these situations, the Fiery War Axe is kind of a catalyst to everything you're doing afterwards. It answers all of their early game threats, and then being able to play a Frothing Berserker on turn 3 and kill a second threat, or being able to, say, like attack an Imp Gang boss and then Ravaging Ghoul with the 2-1 and the 1-1, leaving them with a 1-1, it's a pretty good situation to be in. When you have Twilight Guardian. Oh, I'm sorry. With the Fiery War Axe, also Blood to Ichor fits into that pool as well. You can keep Blood to Ichor, if you have Fiery War Axe. It's not too great, but you can keep it. Sometimes I will, sometimes I won't. I'm still toying with that one. When you have Twilight Guardian, you need to find your early game action. This is a card I still keep, but suddenly I look at these cards and they become a lot more valuable in this situation. Just being able to open into Twilight Guardian, I think, is super important. So when you have Twilight Guardian, always remember to mulligan pretty aggressively for your early game action. Again, I would definitely be keeping it, but something I would consider doing is maybe keeping a slam with a Twilight Guardian. Say you're going second. So now you can turn 2 slams, a Knife Juggler, a Flame Imp, and then you can coin out Twilight Guardian, and it forces them to either have Power Overwhelming or maybe just give up the board in that situation. But that's typically how I've been mulliganing with this deck, and keeping a lot of pressure on my opponents to make sure that I can win games and win them very effectively. When you have these early game cards, your opponent's going to struggle to deal with them, just like you struggle to deal with your opponent's early game cards. Cards like Kor'kron Elite and Blackwing Corruptor can swing your board back, and then your endgame cards like Draconid Crusher, Malkarok, Grommash, and Ragnaros can do the heavy carrying for you. I hope you found this video informative. Please let me know what you thought of it in the comments if you'd like to see more mulligan charts like this. These take me a little bit longer to make, but I enjoy doing them. So let me know what you thought in the comments below. If you want to watch gameplay live, twitch.tv/that'sadmirable. 12 to 6 p.m. Pacific time, Monday through Friday, unless I'm traveling for an event, be it competing or casting or whatever it's going to be. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.